What happened to Abraham Lincoln's family? The man who preserved the Union, freed the slaves, and died a martyr. His name echoes through American history. But after the assassination, what became of the people who shared his blood? Did his legacy carry on through his children? Or did history quietly close the chapter on the House of Lincoln? It's a story few know, a story of brilliance, sorrow, and the strange weight of being born into a name too large for life itself. Let's rewind the clock, back to a time when the Lincoln name wasn't yet etched into stone monuments, but lived in laughter, struggle, and the warmth of a family home. The only one of Abraham Lincoln's 4 sons to survive into adulthood was Robert Todd Lincoln. Born in Springfield, Illinois, Robert was just 21 years old when his father was assassinated. Imagine that. Your father, the President of the United States, shot and killed, and you're barely old enough to vote. Robert carried that trauma, along with the Lincoln name, into a world that didn't know how to let him be ordinary. He wasn't just a man, he was his father's son. And that came with a kind of burden you can't escape, no matter how far you run. But Robert didn't run. He built a life of quiet power. He became a lawyer, then served as Secretary of War under Presidents Garfield and Arthur, ironically, standing at Garfield's side the moment he, too, was shot. Yes, Robert Lincoln was present or nearby for the assassinations of 3 U.S. presidents, his father, James Garfield, and William McKinley. They called it the Lincoln Curse. And Robert, he started to believe it. Tragedy seemed to circle the Lincolns like a storm. Robert's mother, Mary Todd Lincoln, struggled deeply with grief after her husband's death and after losing 3 of her 4 sons. Her mental health spiraled. Eventually, Robert had her committed to a psychiatric hospital. That decision haunted him for the rest of his life. Imagine the guilt. The only surviving son, the caretaker of a fractured legacy, the one who held the broken pieces of the Lincoln family and watched them slip through his fingers. But still, Robert kept going. He became president of the Pullman Company, the most prestigious railroad company in America at the time. He was wealthy, respected, dignified, but always in the shadow of a father who had become more myth than man. He married Mary Harlan, and together they had 3 children. At last, the Lincoln bloodline seemed secure. Their eldest daughter, Mary Mamie Lincoln, was charming and social, a fixture in Washington society. Their son, Abraham Lincoln II, nicknamed Jack, was brilliant, studying in Europe and destined for greatness. But destiny doesn't always listen. Jack died at age 16 from a simple infection that medicine at the time couldn't fight. Another Lincoln lost, another future erased. Robert never fully recovered from his son's death. You can feel the weight in his letters, in the way he slowly withdrew from public life. The Lincoln line was thinning, and it was only a matter of time before the question turned from who were they to what happened to them. And so we leave Robert in his later years, an old man haunted by a name, a legacy, and a family slipping into the folds of forgotten history. But his descendants did live on. For a time, Robert Todd Lincoln died in 1926. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, far from the quiet hills of Springfield, Illinois, where his father once lived and was laid to rest. But while Robert's journey ended, the question remained: would the Lincoln legacy live on through his children? Let's pick up where we left off. Mary Mamie Lincoln, Robert's eldest daughter, was the oldest grandchild of Abraham Lincoln. Raised with wealth and social standing, she lived in a world her grandfather never knew, a world of country clubs, Europe-bound steamships, and Victorian privilege. Mamie had a taste for elegance and society, but she also carried the emotional scars of a family forever touched by grief. She was particularly close to her younger brother Jack, so when he died at 16, something in her dimmed. She married Charles Bradford Isham, a wealthy man from New York, and they had 1 son, Lincoln Isham, born in 1892. At last, a great-grandson, a 4th-generation Lincoln, a flicker of hope. But Lincoln Isham was a quiet, reclusive man, brilliant, artistic, but disinterested in the weight of his lineage. He studied literature and law, but he never married, never had children, and he rarely spoke publicly about his famous great-grandfather. He lived a life of quiet anonymity in Vermont, guarding the past but never passing it on. When Lincoln Isham died in 1971, a door gently closed and a direct male line of Abraham Lincoln vanished with him. But there was still one more grandchild of Lincoln, Jessie Harlan Lincoln, the youngest daughter of Robert. Born in 1875, Jessie was spirited, unconventional, and determined to make her own way. In many ways, she was the boldest of the Lincoln grandchildren. She married 3 times, had a turbulent personal life, but raised 2 daughters, Mary Lincoln Beckwith and Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith. These 2 would be the last of the line. Mary, nicknamed Peggy, was intelligent, independent, and fiercely private. She shunned the spotlight entirely, lived on a secluded estate in Vermont, farmed, painted, fixed engines, lived simply and on her own terms. She never married, never had children. She was said to resemble her great-grandfather more than anyone else, tall, angular, solemn-eyed. But Peggy never embraced the fame. She retreated from it, as if the Lincoln name wasn't a crown, but a curse. Her brother, Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, lived a slightly more public life. He was born into legacy, but like the others, he tried to live beyond it. A lawyer by training, a gentleman farmer by lifestyle, Beckwith married twice, but had no confirmed children. In fact, his second wife once claimed to have borne him a son, Timothy Lincoln Beckwith, but Beckwith insisted the child wasn't his. A court sided with him. And so, when Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith died in 1985, he took with him something quietly profound. He was the last confirmed living descendant of Abraham Lincoln. That's right. The great emancipator, arguably the most revered American in history, has no living direct descendants today. His family tree, once full of promise, dwindled to a silent, solitary end. From Abraham to Robert to Mary, Jack, Jessie, to Mary Beckwith and Robert Beckwith. And then, nothing. No sons, no daughters, no one to carry the name forward. It's a story that feels like a Shakespearean arc. Greatness, tragedy, quiet legacy, and a slow disappearance into time's rearview mirror. But the story isn't just about endings, because even though Lincoln's bloodline ended, his legacy didn't. By the time Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith passed away in 1985, the direct line of Abraham Lincoln had reached its quiet conclusion. No surviving children, no grandchildren, no one to carry the Lincoln name forward into the 21st century. And yet, something of Lincoln remained. Because legacy isn't just carried in names or bloodlines. Sometimes it lingers in choices, in values, in the quiet dignity of how a family bears the weight of a nation's reverence. Robert Beckwith never tried to capitalize on his name. He didn't give speeches, write memoirs, or sit for documentaries. In fact, he lived in almost complete anonymity. When asked, he would sometimes politely acknowledge his ancestry, but he refused to make a spectacle of it. He reportedly once said, "It's hard to know what people want from me when they hear who I'm related to." There was a kind of grace in that, a choice to live without fanfare in a world that so easily turns lineage into currency. His sister, Mary Beckwith, Peggy, was even more private. She never gave interviews. She lived alone on a Vermont estate that once belonged to her grandfather, Robert Todd Lincoln. There, she farmed the land, read voraciously, and, when asked, politely deflected questions about her family. That estate, known as Hildene, is perhaps the most tangible piece of the Lincoln family's legacy outside of Washington. Built by Robert Todd Lincoln in 1905, Hildene was where the Lincolns lived, not as national figures, but simply as a family. It became Peggy Beckwith's refuge, and after her death in 1975, it was nearly lost to time. But local preservationists stepped in. Today, Hildene is a museum and historical site, a serene, dignified tribute, not just to Abraham Lincoln, but to his descendants who lived quietly in its halls. Visitors walk through its rooms, see Robert Lincoln's books, Mary's letters, Peggy's paintings. There's a piano in the parlor, a greenhouse still blooming, and a sense that the Lincoln story didn't disappear. It simply settled into quieter soil. Here, Lincoln's values echo, not through speeches or marble monuments, but through the simplicity of a life lived with humility. That might be the most Lincoln-like legacy of all. And there's something else. Though the bloodline ended, the fascination never did. Writers, historians, genealogists, even distant relatives through extended branches have all kept the flame alive. People want to know what happened, want to feel a connection to the man whose words reshaped a nation. There have been rumors, of course, whispers of illegitimate children. A disputed paternity claim involving Timothy Lincoln Beckwith, the child born during Robert Beckwith's second marriage. But DNA tests were never conducted, and the courts ruled there was no proven connection. If there are descendants out there, they've never come forward. And so, history closed its book, leaving behind not a family dynasty, but something more elusive, a legend. Because in truth, Lincoln's legacy was never just about family. It was about ideals, about the belief that a person can rise from nothing and leave something greater behind. Robert Lincoln may have served presidents, Mary Beckwith may have painted in solitude, but none of them tried to be Abraham Lincoln. And that, perhaps, is what makes their story quietly beautiful. They didn't chase fame, they carried the name, carefully, quietly, without spectacle. And then, when the time came, they let it go. But legacy has a strange way of living on, in school children reciting the Gettysburg Address, in justice and law shaped by Lincoln's vision, in places like Hildene, and in the millions who see themselves in the story of a rail splitter who changed the world. The story of Abraham Lincoln's descendants ends quietly, with no heirs, no dynastic line, no one left to carry his name into the 21st century. But here's the thing, maybe that's not how legacies work. Because even though the Lincoln family tree has no living branches, Abraham Lincoln's legacy grows wider every day, not in his bloodline, but in his impact, in what he stood for, in what he gave, and maybe in what he lost. Lincoln knew loss intimately. He lost his mother as a child, buried 2 sons before he ever reached the White House, and another while he was in it. He led the country through its darkest hours and was murdered before he could see its healing begin. His descendants, too, lived in the shadow of that loss. Each generation seemed to inherit not just his name, but his sorrow. And perhaps that's why they lived the way they did. Quiet, private, sometimes troubled, always cautious. They were more than names in a history book. They were people trying to carry the weight of a myth. And eventually, they let that myth go. What's remarkable, in a way, is that none of Lincoln's descendants tried to capitalize on the name. No memoirs, no political campaigns, no branded foundations. They lived like people who knew that their connection to history was sacred, but not for sale. They lived instead with a sense of stewardship, of quiet reverence, of respect for something much larger than themselves. And so, today, the Lincoln legacy lives elsewhere. It lives in monuments of marble and words carved in stone. But more powerfully, it lives in ideas. It lives in the belief that unity is worth fighting for, that freedom is a promise worth keeping, that words, when chosen with care and courage, can reshape a nation. You see, being a descendant isn't just about DNA. It's about the lives we choose to lead in the shadow of those who came before us. Lincoln's family may be gone, but his real descendants are us, the teachers who read his speeches aloud in class, the citizens who vote with conscience, the leaders who choose unity over division, the ordinary people who, like Lincoln himself once did, believe that no matter where you start, you can make something meaningful of your life. It's easy to feel a pang of sadness at the end of the Lincoln line. No sons or daughters to carry on the name, no family photos past the 1980s, no one to ask what it was like to grow up as the great-great-grandchild of a president. But maybe that's what keeps the story sacred. Maybe it's precisely because it ended so quietly that we treat it with such reverence. Lincoln gave everything, his voice, his mind, his heart, and in the end, his life. He left behind not just a fractured family, but a mended nation. And the people who followed him, his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, they didn't need to live loudly to honor him. They just had to live with dignity. Abraham Lincoln said, "In the end, it's not the years in your life that count. It's the life in your years." So when we ask, whatever happened to Abraham Lincoln's descendants? The real answer is this: they lived, they struggled, they carried the name with quiet pride. And then, like all human stories, they came to an end. But Abraham Lincoln's true legacy? That didn't die with them. It lives in us.